And so then to introduce our speaker, Suzanne Koven, MD, has practiced internal medicine for 30 plus years and was named Inaugural Writer in Residence at Massachusetts General Hospital. Her essays, articles, blogs, and reviews have appeared in the Boston Globe, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, NewYorker.com, and other publications. She will lead today's conversation about narrative writing and storytelling for women in science and medicine. So our events are free of charge, and we do intend to keep it that way. However, if you would like to donate to our speaker today, we would really appreciate it, as we believe that our presenters' time are valuable and honorariums are important. So we will go ahead and turn this over to Suzanne Koven for her presentation.
Kristen, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I look forward to a chance to unshare my slides and see everyone. That's the best part. And I will leave plenty of time for a good conversation at the end. Let's see. Go. So, as you heard, I'm a physician, a primary care doctor, and um, late mid career, I took on an additional career as a nonfiction writer, a columnist, essayist, and author. And I have to say, for a long time, I saw these as really two separate things, and people would often ask me, "Oh, how do you combine your two careers?" Except as time has gone on, I really don't see them as different because, and here's the take home and the punchline, medicine, and I should say, I know not all of you are interested in medicine. Some of you are scientists. Everything I'm going to say will apply to science as well. Um, I really think that medicine and writing are rooted in storytelling. And as time has gone on, as I say, I no longer think of my two careers as separate. I think of them as the same. So, um, being that as it may, it seems like a good place to start is to tell you a little bit about my story. So here I am on my left in front row, second from the right. I'm a chief resident in medicine at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. I'm rocking my bad 80s hair and my shoulder pads. And if you had asked me, um, where I was in my life at that point, I would have said that this moment was a culmination of a choice I had made many years before. And that choice was to go in the direction of science and medicine as opposed to humanities. I had not been a very good science or math student in high school. I didn't particularly enjoy those subjects. I loved reading and writing. I was an English major in college, but I always had this nagging feeling that if I somehow could hold my breath and get through the basic sciences, I would really enjoy medicine. My dad had been a doctor. I loved tagging along with him on rounds. But I just faced two barriers. One was that in my generation of childhood, which was the 60s and 70s, there just were not many female physicians. I didn't know any, and I didn't really have any role models. But honestly, a much bigger barrier was this idea I had that I wasn't that type of person. I wasn't a math and science type of person, and therefore I couldn't be a doctor. In college, as an English major, I took and dropped introductory chemistry 3 times. And I always dropped it, that last day before you'd get a W for withdrew on the transcript. I just had a complete mental block about the whole thing. And then finally, I graduated. I got my first job, a very, very, very low level job in publishing. I hated it. And I thought, well, what about that medicine thing? I bet uh, I could take chemistry, and I bet I could do it. So I did, and I went to medical school, and I did a residency. I became a chief resident, and as I say, I would have told you, okay, so I guess I'm not gonna be an English humanities type of person. I've thrown my lot in with science and medicine. Well, I wish I'd known then what I know now, which is that that's entirely wrong-headed thinking. In fact, from antiquity, um, the arts, poetry, humanities, and medicine, and science even, have been thought to be not only compatible, but in some ways just two sides of a coin. In ancient Greece, Apollo was the god of both medicine and poetry. Here you see medicine represented by a snake and poetry by a lyre, Lyre, that is. Now, I think in terms that are a little bit more congenial to our modern sensibility, I like to think of this in terms of left brain and right brain. The left brain is sort of more math and sciencey. The right brain is more creative, humanities oriented, if you will. And yet, any physician, indeed, I think any scientist would tell you that you need both halves to pursue those activities effectively. So, in fact, this thought I had that, well, I'm not going to be that kind of person anymore. I need to be this kind of person was, as I say, it was wrong-headed, and yet it persists. This idea, I still get asked when I give talks to undergraduates, really, I can really be um, an English major or history major or philosophy major, a dance major, and go to medical school. Is that really something I can do? Well, indeed, you can. Um, So getting back to and getting a little bit more specific about the role of storytelling in medicine. This is the Edwin Smith papyrus. It's a hieroglyphic that is named after the British archaeologist who discovered and translated it. It's from 1600 BCE, and it's a collection of the first known written medical case histories. Now, in case your hieroglyphics are a little rusty, here is a translation of case number 4. It's translated in somewhat archaic and stilted English. I'll say what it says in modern translation. And it says, if you find the skull of a man is split, you shouldn't bind him, but you should moor him uh, sitting. You make supports of brick. So this is an early cervical collar, if you will. Uh, and here's the part of it that I think is very interesting to me from a narrative point of view. The last line, which is that then, having seen this one man and treated him in this way, every other man you see with the same problem, a split skull, you should treat in the same way. In other words, we go from the individual to the general principle. And that, in fact, is how we teach medicine today in medical school. If that's where you're headed, you will learn a few things about diabetes, its pathophysiology, and so forth, and the drugs used to treat it. But then you won't stop there. You'll learn about this person living with diabetes and that person and the next person. And you will see how the principles get applied to each person in ways that are similar and in ways that are individualized. Why do I belabor this point? Because if we think about it, going from the specific to the general is really the way fiction works. If we read any fiction, Anna Karenina, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, we read, I think, for a few reasons. One is the pleasure of turning the pages and learning what happens next. And it doesn't matter whether it's a beach read or Shakespeare, that pleasure is there. But there's another reason, and it applies especially, I think, to the best literature. There's something about that individual story that lets us know something broader about human nature and then ultimately about ourselves. So the specific story is the most effective way to make the general point. This is true in medicine, and this is true in fiction and other narrative arts. Now, when I was well into my medical career, in my early 50s, as a matter of fact, I went back to graduate school and I got an MFA in nonfiction writing. And while I was there, I learned about something called the Freytag pyramid. It's sometimes called the Freytag triangle. And what it is it's a kind of a basic outline of story or a plot. And just about any story you can think of, more or less, fits into this outline. There's an exposition where we meet the main character, Cinderella. Her mother dies, her father remarries, there's a mean stepmother, there are mean stepsisters, inciting incident. There's going to be a ball. There's a rising action. The sisters prepare for the ball. Cinderella's left alone. The fairy godmother comes and turns the pumpkin into the coach, etc., etc. Then there's a climax. 12 o'clock, the pumpkin turns back into, the coach turns back into a pumpkin, etc., etc. There's a falling action. She lost the slipper. They find the slipper. There's a resolution. Happily ever after is the denouement. And almost any story you can think of more or less fits this scheme. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, this seems awfully familiar, and yet I know I had never studied this when I was an English major. And I realized the reason it was so familiar is that I had been taught in medical school to present patient cases in a format very similar to this. And I had, in fact, been telling patient stories in a professional capacity just like this. In medicine, the exposition in which we meet our main character, in this case, the patient, used to be called the chief complaint. It's now called the chief concern. I should change that. Concern is a much nicer way of putting it. And then there's this rising action. What is it that brought this person into the emergency room, into the hospital, into the clinic? That's the leads to the climax. And then there's a bunch of stuff that happens. There's an evaluation, and it ends with a resolution and a denouement. A provisional diagnosis is made, and a decision is made as to what the plan should be. And I thought, gosh, in medical school, we were trained to tell stories in a very, very particular way. Isn't that interesting? But of course, it's obvious too, because stories are how human beings have evolved to communicate. Animals do not tell stories. Only human beings tell stories. And what is a story? If we were all in a room together, as I wish we were, I would ask you that. And ultimately, you'd scratch your head. It's hard to say what a story is. But then I would say, well, okay, what does a story have to be a story? And then you'd say, well, you have to have characters, and there's usually a main character, and stuff happens, and it usually happens in a particular order. And then there's a conflict, and the conflict gets resolved, or sometimes it doesn't get resolved, and so forth. That is what a story is. That's how we communicate with each other. That's how we build relationship with each other. And that's how we foster empathy by learning each other's stories. If I were to ask anyone on this call, why are you signed in today? Why are you listening to this? I would get as many different stories as there are numbers of you. It might be, well, I might want to combine my career in medicine with writing. I want to hear a little more about that. It might be that you're an early career scientist and you've heard about the role of narrative in science. I don't know what the story would be, but you would tell it to me in the form of story. You would not give me data points. What do I mean by that? When we craft a story, as opposed to data points or bullets, when we communicate with one another, we decide where to begin. We decide what to include. We decide what to emphasize. We decide what to omit, right? So if you say to your friend, how was your day? Or what's new? The most, sort of neutral of questions, you will get a story in return. And the next time you interact with someone, notice how they naturally launch into a story, because that is how we have evolved to be in the world and to make sense of the chaos of reality. Now, given all I've said, it's not shocking to know that there have been many more physician writers than banker writers or engineer writers or plumber writers. Writing and storytelling are so deeply embedded in medicine that many physicians have been writers. One of my favorites is William Carlos Williams. He was a more than full-time practicing obstetrician and pediatrician in Rutherford, New Jersey in the early 20th century. He practiced out of the first floor of his house. His front steps were his waiting room, and he wrote some of the greatest poems of the 20th century, beginning on prescription pads. He said famously, as a writer, I've been a physician, as a physician, a writer. Some of you may have memorized in middle school one of his most famous poems. It's called An Apology, about I have eaten the plums in the icebox that you were probably saving for breakfast. They were so sweet and so cold. That emerged from a note that he left his wife and office assistant on what was then called an icebox, a refrigerator. They left each other notes. He would go out on a house call, and she would leave dinner in the icebox and put a note on the door that said, Bill, I left you meatloaf and potatoes to heat up. And one day, he ate the plums that she was probably saving for breakfast. They were so sweet and so cold. And he left her that note, and that note became that famous poem. Not long ago, just for fun, I started listing in chronological order some of my favorite doctor writers, beginning with medieval times and Maimonides. And I noticed something, which as we moved toward the end of the 20th century, this list started getting less male and less white. And then I made a list of some of the writers I admire, some of whom I've had the pleasure to mentor or work with, who are under 40 or so, some of them in their 20s and early 30s. And I noticed that they were predominantly female. Many were people of color, and several were members of the LGBTQ community. So, doctor writers are becoming much more diverse, and their contributions to the conversation around medicine is, I think, very much the richer for it. So, if it's such an obvious thing that medicine and, let's say, science and storytelling go together, what would prevent us from writing our stories? Well, here are the things that are the most common, particularly among my medical colleagues. First, we think they're not good enough. You know, how did we get to medical school? We got to medical school by getting good grades and good test scores and being good and not making mistakes and not taking risks sometimes. Well, writing requires mistakes. It requires risk taking. It requires getting a draft on a page and saying, this is awful. In fact, those things are necessary to writing. Those things are not encouraged in pre med and medical school, and perhaps not in science either. We wonder if they might be self indulgent. After all, we go into medicine with the idea that we're going to serve humanity, and here we are writing and sort of broadcasting our singular voices. Isn't that self-indulgent? Isn't it selfish? It's not, but I think it's something we worry about. If we're in medicine, we are concerned about patient confidentiality and colleague confidentiality. That's a legitimate concern, but we can get around it, and I'll talk about that more if you like. We wonder, and this is something I hear a lot from students and even from medical school applicants. We worry that if we're too personally revealing, we'd be considered unprofessional. If I write this, what will they think of me on the admissions committee? If I write this, what will my residency program director think of me? And on and on. I certainly understand why people feel this way, and I think in some cases it's a realistic concern. More often, I've seen that bold writing, even if it's deeply personal and deeply revealing, is admired. I write from a very, very personal point of view, and I publish in some pretty austere places, and no one has ever called me unprofessional. If you think, well, yeah, that's easy for you to say, you're well established in your career, I can point you to any number of essays written by early career and even student writers about deeply personal and controversial things that earned them perhaps controversy, but mostly, I think, admiration, and certainly from me. We wonder about being unscientific. If we tell a story, isn't that anecdotal? Isn't that unscientific? The term anecdotal medicine is actually a kind of a put down in medicine. You know, where's the evidence for that? That's just perhaps the last two patients you saw. There are all kinds of jokes about that. In fact, we use anecdotal medicine all the time. We talk about case histories. We use in certainly in medical education, as I mentioned before, we use individuals to make a point about uh, about medical conditions generally. So I'm all for anecdotal medicine. And then finally, especially if we're doing personal kinds of writing, we think, gosh, the problems are so big and I'm so small. Who wants to hear about my little story in a world in which there's climate change and war and pandemics and so forth? And yet, stories have the power. In fact, they may be the only things that have the power to influence these big forces. I think of Greta Thunberg, who, as a, I think, 16-year-old, decided one Friday afternoon to sit in front of the Swedish parliament with a sign, a backpack, and a water bottle and go on strike for climate change. A year later, 1 million students joined her. So don't discount the power of the small story. This is just about anecdotal medicine, which, as I say, far from being a bad thing, is used in all aspects of medicine, especially in public health, which is a great interest of mine. I'm involved in a master's program at Harvard where we use storytelling techniques, podcasting, essays, film, and so forth to advance public health. People are moved by stories, they're educated by stories much more so than statistics and maps. So if you're trying to move the needle on things like vaccine resistance or reproductive rights, stories are, are the most effective way to do it. So there are many benefits of storytelling. We know, and there's actually some good data about this, that we can use storytelling to relieve stress and help heal trauma. We can use it to educate. We can use it to amplify and advocate for voices left less often heard. We can use storytelling to expose injustice and advance policy and cultural change, and even make beauty out of the bleakest subject matter. So, if you're writing in the medical sphere, and I should say in the science sphere as well, I think there are sort of three broad categories you might think about exploring. The first is editorial or advocacy. You can write op-eds in which you're using an illustrative story. You may want to educate the public or your professional peers. And then finally, you may choose to do what I do, which is to tell personal stories in the service of some broader point. And here's a few examples of some of my physician colleagues, women, who have used storytelling in their writing, I think, to wonderful effect. This is Dr. Rana Audich. She's an ICU doctor in Detroit. And when she was pregnant, she suffered a massive hemorrhage, lost her baby, and ended up near death in her own ICU, in the ICU in which she was working. And she was in shock in the sense that she had lost a massive amount of blood. But she was in shock in the other sense, too, in that she couldn't believe how uncompassionate the care she received was, even in her own ICU. On one occasion, uh, not long after she arrived, a resident, a trainee, was at the bedside and doing an ultrasound on her pregnant abdomen. And Rana said, well, the heart's not beating, that the baby is dead. And the resident, thinking more about Rana at that point as a great case than as a woman in enormous physical and emotional distress, actually asked her to teach him how to identify that the baby's heart wasn't beating, her own baby. So she went on a personal mission to raise awareness about lack of compassion in medical settings, and particularly in the treatment of people who are so seriously ill that caregivers assume they can't see, they can't hear. It really doesn't matter how they're treated. This is Michelle Harper. She's an emergency room doctor who came from a really, really difficult background. And she wrote this wonderful memoir, The Beauty in Breaking, in which she used her own personal traumas um, to explore the trauma that she was witnessing in the ER. And it's a really lovely, lovely and provocative memoir. This is an early and I think pioneering female um, uh, physician writer, Perry Class, and her career has spanned everything from poetry to fiction to memoir to sort of how-to guide to understanding your and supporting your child with mental differences and so forth. She teaches journalism at NYU, in addition to being a pediatrician. And then Danielle Ofri is also very prolific, and she's written a lot about, um, her titles say it all. What doctors feel, what patients say, what doctors hear. Um, when we do harm, which is about medical error, she's really looking in the same way that Atul Gawande does, to look sort of behind the scenes in medicine to ask, why we do the things we do, and could we be doing them better? So, what about you? Um, what should you write about? And this is, um, all in service of finding your voice, which is in the title of this talk. Well, here's some of the advice that I was given along the way as I went through graduate school and worked with various writing mentors. The first is that to write about what obsesses you, about what you can't get out of your mind. And it doesn't matter that you're a particular kind of person who does a particular kind of thing. In other words, let's suppose a little further down the road that you're a surgeon. Well, you don't have to write about surgery if writing about surgery isn't what you really long to do. You don't want to sort of pigeonhole yourself. You write about the things that you just can't get out of your mind and you want to work out on the page. Another great piece of advice is to write about what you're afraid to write about. In other words, don't write about the thing that you've got all figured out. That will probably lead to really boring writing. Write about that weird thing that you think no one would ever understand if you actually tried to, put it on the page. That's exactly the thing that people will relate to. I've seen it again and again, and I've experienced it again and again. The standard advice is write about what you know. I think better advice is write about what you want to know. Um, more on this. Joan Didion said, I don't know what I think until I try to write it down. In other words, a really good starting point for writing is confusion, is puzzlement. Certainty is a really bad starting point. for writing. It's very analogous to psychotherapy. One of my best friends is a psychiatrist who does a lot of psychotherapy. And what she tells me is that if a client comes in and they say, "Oh, there's just something I've been waiting to tell you, can't wait to tell you," she knows it's not going to be very fruitful because it's kind of a pre-digested, predetermined story. What's much more fruitful is if they're talking about something that seems pretty bland, and all of a sudden the client is surprised by their own tears. That becomes a very fruitful place to probe. And the same thing is true in writing. And I would say every piece I've ever published myself has begun with that moment where I think, why does this piss me off? Why does, why am I reacting this way when no one else is reacting this way? Why do we do things this way in medicine and not that way? And then I write into the question. Sometimes I do research. Sometimes my research is just writing and thinking. So here's a little kind of a trajectory of my own writing career in as a doctor, and this will sort of give you an idea of how you find your voice through trial and error. And this is what I did, and also by paying attention to what subjects constantly sort of um, draw you in and compel you to write about them. So the very first piece I ever published was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. I wrote a piece about why it was. This was a memory that confused me. Um, uh, December holiday time came around. I was a practicing internist, a PCP, and I thought, well, wait a minute, how come my patients never give me any presents? And my dad, who was an orthopedic surgeon, every December he used to get bags of presents. Is it that's a difference between being a PCP and being an orthopedic surgeon? Is it a difference in the generations? Is it a difference in us? Did his patients like him more than they like me? I didn't know the answer. And I kind of wrote this sort of tongue in cheek piece trying to figure out why my patients were not bringing me gifts. And then a few years later, I found myself writing a blog for Psychology Today. Um, I could write it and post it whenever I wanted. Nobody paid me for it, and I wasn't really sure anybody read it. But it was incredibly valuable in terms of developing my voice because I found I kept coming back to the same kinds of stories over and over again. And I realized what fascinated me was the difference between the facts of the case and the story behind those facts. And uh, that's what I wrote about again and again. And on the page, I started sounding more and more and more like myself. People who knew me could recognize me, even at this stage. And here's an example of how you can get a little swayed to write about something that isn't quite your sweet spot just because you have the opportunity to write in a super fancy place. Well, who doesn't want to see their name in the New Yorker? And I wrote a couple of pieces for them, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with them. They're good pieces, but they weren't quite what I wanted to write, and I knew that, and I had a nagging feeling about it. And I'm glad that I paid attention to that instead of thinking, well, if this is what gets me into the New Yorker, maybe this is what I should keep doing. This was a very, I would say, sort of Atul Gawande type of piece, but the type of writing that I knew in my heart was my type of writing was much more personal than that. And so I started writing a column for the Boston Globe. This was a piece I did, which was shared in every continent other than Antarctica, about a patient of mine who was a nurse in my hospital, a woman exactly my age who was dying, and who wanted me to get out the message that palliative care should be more widely offered and available. And she literally was on her deathbed. She wanted me to use her real name. And she was very gratified by our collaboration on this piece. And then, as I say, my writing started getting more and more personal. This was a piece I wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine about how I had always somewhat resisted, as I think many physicians do, people who they consider hypochondriacs. And then I had a severe injury myself in which I found myself falling into what I had previously called hypochondria. And what I came to realize was really just the normal. I'm sorry if there's some background noise. My neighbor has got something going on there. Um, I'm just going to close this. Sorry. Um, is really just the normal relationship between mind and body. And I learned a lot from being injured myself. I got into book reviewing, including Of Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. I started running reading groups. So, see, you never know where this will take you for healthcare workers um, in the hospital cafeteria. This ultimately resulted in my current role as the writer in residence for Massachussetts General Hospital. Um, And then I decided I wanted to write a book. I thought I was writing a book about having missed the diagnosis of heart disease in my mom, but I wasn't getting anywhere with it. And so while I was sort of procrastinating on this project I thought I was supposed to be doing, I wrote a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine in which I wrote a letter to my younger self, myself as an intern 30 years earlier, giving my former self two pieces of news. One, that the gender gap in medicine by various parameters, including salary, promotion, research funding, etc., would persist 30 years later. And the second, much more personally, was that all of those decades I worried about being an imposter, not being good enough, being on the verge of being found out as a fraud, that probably all of that energy would have been better spent, and that what I was feeling actually had a name, which I didn't know then, which is imposter syndrome. Uh, that essay, in fact, is what evolved into a book. And this is just kind of fun. Um, uh, Believe it or not, books have trailers. And this is the one we made for my book. It is exactly 57 seconds long. And I'll play it for you. Whoops. I think I am going to stop there and unshare. There we go. Because I would love to see you and I would love to hear your thoughts. And I apologize for my neighbor's lawnmower.
Well, such things happen. So just a couple little things here before we jump into the Q&A. Thank you. Let's see. Yes, there we are. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Finding It and Using Your Voice, a conversation and narrative writing and about narrative writing and storytelling for women in science and medicine. We hope you have enjoyed it. We are now going to move on to the confidential Q&A session with our presenter. I will be stopping the recording, and then if you have any questions, please let us know. And as a reminder, if you could all have your cameras on so that we can all see each other.
I closed the windows. That should be better. Anyway, so your thoughts.